Real men arising to end the silence around us about the chains that bind us, to dispel the darkness of illusion with luminous spiritual technologies, to finally become the hero within us all. My name is Karun Avatar. This is Arise the Honest Man's podcast. With me is Jai Jagannath, Baicharan, and Hari Vilas. And once again, we are very, very happy to be here for yet another meaningful conversation. What is it that we are engaging with today, Jai Jagannath Prabhu?
Well, we've titled it Technology and the Self-Alienation of Man, which sounds pretty cool. The idea here is we want to discuss how technology may, or in fact is, alienating humanity, but man, from others, from himself, and ultimately from the ground of being, God. That is the general trajectory of the conversation. And I was inspired to do this conversation this week as a follow-up to our conversation last week. So our conversation last week was surrounding the topic, what does it mean to be a man? And in our opening statements, we finally came to the conclusion, after much prying and bewilderment, we finally came to the conclusion, Hari Vilas specifically kicked this off, that fundamentally, like on the most basic level, to be a man means you have the male physical body. And to be a woman means you have the woman physical body. But the way he articulated it was very funny. Like the example he gave for that, which I thought was a little crude and made me laugh, but I also thought was really good, is that when a man and woman have sex, the one that gets pregnant is a woman. And the one who doesn't is a man. And that seems a little bit crude, like prima facie, but it's a very good,
It is true, though.
Exactly. Not only is it true, but when you look at the old world and like scriptures from the old world, like the ones that we follow or in the East or the ones in the West, that seems to be one of the basic fundamental understandings of man and woman that they're working with, that when there's sexual intercourse particularly, then the one that gets pregnant is the woman, the one who doesn't is the man. And that will also determine the trajectory of social contracts, obviously, because the one who gets pregnant is taking out of the field of work, for example, to rear the child, and the man has to fill in the space like that. The social contracts, there's a sort of congruence between the social contracts and that fundamental understanding of man and woman. And then Hari Vilas last week said this, and this is what inspired me for this topic today. Technology changes that. And he went on to describe it a little bit, but I thought we might flesh this out a little bit more, how technology changes that and specifically changes how men and women view themselves, and thus necessarily, in congruence with that, change the way that the social contracts are formed and made and moving forward. So I thought that was a really fascinating idea that would be worth exploring. So I guess the first question in unpacking this idea is, is technology a bane or boom? I know you've probably seen way too many presentations in spiritual communities about this. And the general message, as far as I've seen a few of them, is it's neither good or bad, it's how you use it, which seems, a little bit simplistic, but that's usually the message. It's like a knife. A knife is neither good or bad. It's just how you use it. So similarly, technology isn't. But in the blurb that we use for this topic today, the message, I don't know who wrote it, but the message was like, use the word like venom. So it's kind of comparing technology to venom, or comparing it to a thorn. And just as you remove one thorn with another thorn, or you remove venom by also applying venom in a medicinal way. So technology is a thorn, it is a venom that can be used to help remove the problem. But ultimately, it's like negative in that sense, which I think is closer to my own sentiment about it. And so my first question is very simple. From your understanding, from your own rumination, and also maybe your own subjective experience, is technology a bane or boon? And specifically in terms of how it's transformed the way you maybe think or see yourself as a man. It doesn't have to be a very scholarly understanding, just sort of more intuitive or from your own ruminations. And before you answer that, so that's the question. And before you answer that, I just wanted to give my own quick reflections, because I tend to not give them when I ask the questions. But this is just following from what I heard from Hari Vilas. I'm kind of leaning hard towards technology is pretty negative, and it has a very adverse negative impact on humanity in general and on men and specifically. And the way that I kind of have a trajectory in my thinking. The first is that it sort of creates this false, or let me say artificial, maybe a better word than false, this sort of artificial equality. And let's just take a simple technology like birth control, working off of that fundamental basis of what it means to be a man and woman. Birth control creates a sort of artificial equality. Now you can have sex and no one gets pregnant. And so with that, what follows is sort of a divorcing of the pleasure principle from values. Because previously, or from responsibility, if you have to have sex, especially in the heterosexual relationship specifically, there's chance of having a child, which means that in the back of your head, the pleasure principle can never truly be divorced from the responsibility principle, unless you're just like a jerk. And that's another sort of topic for the future, toxic masculinity and all that. So you have now technology equaling the playing field. No one gets pregnant. So the pleasure principle becomes divorced from the responsibility principle, which means that now you can be totally self-centered without having to think about your responsibility to others. And then that changes the way the social contracts kind of work. Specifically for society, social contract will be really concerned about you having children, because in order for you to continue your society, there has to be children. So they're invested in successful relationships so that they will give children that can help keep their society functioning, at least 2 for, maintaining the population, and more than 2 if you want to do a little bit more for the society. So that all gets completely wiped out because of a simple technology like birth control, for example, or even further along, abortion. And then I kind of have as my final point here, if the technology keeps moving at the rate that it has been moving, it seems to be outpacing our socialization mechanisms for dealing with it in a moral way. And so, especially looking at the generation of young men, and I can speak about this from a personal experience, it's outpaced our ability to socialize it morally. And so the moral engagement with technology is, not really to be seen. Even the way that we talk to each other on social media, for example, when we're upset and so on, it's just something it's outpacing our ability to morally socialize it. Anyway, so
there's actually there's
moving, and it seems that tech is negative. So that's my thing. Sorry, yeah.
Right. No. I just want to add, like, exactly on that point, Ram Kishore just said, the boon of it is that it always allows me to have devotee association across the world. Globally, I would agree it is a bane, because people say things they would never say to your face.
Right. So, and the boon part, well, anyway, so I'm going to hear your thoughts. Bane or boon? I'm leaning more towards, there are obviously pros and cons to tech, like there's pros and cons to anything. I'm talking about overall, if you had to give the edge to one of them, do you give the edge to a bane or do you give the edge to a boon? And I gave my little logic here for why I'm leaning towards is probably a boon. It's like really venom. And unless we learn how to engage with it in a healthy way, we're going to lose our own selves in the technology. And therefore, overall, it's a bane. But I want to hear your thoughts. Again, the question of bane or boon, and particularly how it impacts you intuitively or from your own study as a man. That's my opening question. Sorry for speaking a lot, but I really wanted to flesh that out to get the full context here.
Hey, bro, it's your show.
It's our show. All right.
Can we put Harvey Loss on the spot?
Yeah, let's put Harvey Loss, because this was inspired largely by your own comment last week. So I was really keen to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, firstly, technology has always existed. There can be no humanity without technology, because human society always inevitably transforms its environment wherever you let humans go. So I would say it's more a question of, there's this one interesting author, Ivan Illich, and he wrote a lot about modern society, is very critical, but he also spoke about technology, and he called this term called convivial technology, meaning that technology that we understand what will be the long-term consequences. And in that way, we choose to adopt it or not. Like, for example, Prabhupada made the point in the Krishna book, how the Brahmanas, they knew about electricity, but they were like, nah, it's not worth it, it's not going to be worth it to go there. Just stick with cow dung and, fire. And so, but the point is, but there's always been technology, growing grain, growing food. It's all tech, using a plow. So tech has always been there, but there's the problem with modern tech is that, for example, what happens is that certain technological devices, they transform the entire playing field. For example, at a certain point, we created cars, and it was a novel introduction to human society. But now it is impossible to survive without a car. Same goes for smartphones. So the point is that they basically, as they transform the world, the actual environment it forces it now onto us. And you can't choose anymore. God, I don't want a phone. I don't want a cell phone. I don't want a car. I'm a horrible driver, and I've already wrecked 2 cars. So I don't really
Me
want
too, bro, too.
But you can't avoid it. So that's the one problem that's being laid out, is that technology, as we create these things, it is forced upon us. And then we can't actually get out of it, because it becomes, you have to play the game to able to keep up. And so many people try to clock out, but you can't anymore. So that's a big issue. The second one to understand is definitely that, technology is definitely the great equalizer. When we look at the traditional world, it's very interesting. We look at the traditional world and we see a hierarchical society. It is generally based on class, gender, so many things. We see the strict hierarchies built in the ancient society. And then we think, it was just purely a societal construct. No, it wasn't. It's like technology is what dismantled that hierarchy. Like, for example, if you would go back 1,000 years into the past, to fight in a war, there's only a few guys who could do that. Take a sword and a shield and go to another guy, look him in the eye, and try and slash him. But now, if you look at the gun, for example, was what equalized the playing field. Now you can have one guy, you send him to boot camp for 3 months. He doesn't come from any kind of military family. He's just, you take an average guy off the street, you put a gun in his hand. Even in Africa, they have child soldiers. You have a 12-year-old kid, you put a gun in his hand, and he can kill grown-ups. So technology is the equalizer. It basically annihilates distinctions between people to a certain extent. Same with gender. That's a point I made last time. People are now saying, the ancient world is so hierarchical, differentiated. Yeah, but there wasn't technology. So or the kind of technology we have today. So it meant the differences between the sexes was vast. It was vast practical implications, and therefore they dealt with it differently. So tech is then, it's a fact. It is leveling the playing field. The distinction between people become less. And also now, for example, even how intelligent you are, it's like, it's very interesting. One thing oftentimes mentioned is the problem with technology now is that it is also creating a new kind of elite in terms of the people, they call it a technocracy, the people who know how to use this technology. And now we see, for example, that how much of our information and our privacy and stuff is all in the hands of people that they have no moral qualification, but they're merely the guys who are in charge of the tech. So it's again a new hierarchy will arise, but it's definitely not biological. And I predict, as you said, also the future is that I see urban society will become more and more androgynous to a certain extent, because the traditional masculine virtues like physical strength and these kind of things becomes more and more irrelevant in a technological society. And we will even see, it's very interesting to see how the genders will adapt to this reality and will become sort of what really makes the difference. Everybody's on birth control. And, it's like you don't really need physical strength, just on the computer, and your head will just grow very big. And it doesn't really matter. Your biological identity will become more irrelevant. So I don't know what you say about that. It sounds like the brain to me.
I was reminded of a few things, but the last point, I'm reminded of a Sylvester Stallone movie. I forget the name of the movie, but he gets like frozen in something for like, I don't know, 1,000 years. And then he comes out of it in the future. And at one point, the love interest in the movie, he wants to have sex with her basically. And she's like, she's ready, let's do this. And then she gives him a virtual, like a VR set to put on.
Oh, yeah.
And then they're like, having sex through the VR set. Then he like takes it off and is like, what the F is this? You're just quite bewildered. So anyway, just some scar coming up, hearing that point.
Yeah, but exactly, yeah. So moving away from the biological towards some kind of virtual reality. And whether that's good or bad,
So you're leaning more towards Bang too.
Well, I'm just leaning up to the point that it's inevitable. Like,
right.
I think it's ultimately it's due to consciousness that is entering too deeply into the world. You know, it's that human intelligence that is very interesting. How at a certain point, this is Oswald Spengler. He wrote about how if you look at traditional Western society, which is where this whole technological society comes from, basically at a certain point in the modern era, then you had all these monks in the monasteries. And they, for a long time, they were cultivating God consciousness, and society was very simple. Like we see in India, people purposefully kept society simple. Like you purposefully don't complicate things, you know. And then what happened is in Western society, there was just this shift where the intelligence, and this is the early scientists, mostly monks like Gregor Mendel, all these people, they were all these geneticists, physicists, they were all, many of them were monks, most of them were religious people. But they started to turn that human intelligence that was previously absorbed in theology, they pushed it into understanding matter. And he calls it this, he calls them the Vikings of the intellect. So these individuals, it's very violent, it's a violent energy where they started to try to, but by the intelligence try to control matter. And the whole society that we have is the result of that kind of orientation towards the world. Who is it? Roger Bacon says, we have to torture Mother Nature for her secrets. You know, that was the basic understanding, because all these things, all these wonderful things we can do now, it's actually a very violent energy that is going into trying to change the actual material reality. Whereas the general Sattvic principle, the principle of simple living, high thinking, is that you understand that the world is already designed in a certain way. Let me adjust to how the world is already designed, rather than me trying to change the design. And that basic orientation is the difference between the mode of goodness and the mode of passion. And we see so different societies are in different modes of nature.
Amazing. Yeah. So technology is, yeah, right. Technology has always been there. But looking at long-term effect, you have to make a decision about whether or not to use it. If consciousness enters too deep into matter, then their direction of technology will be destructive, because it will be a profound imposition on the whole playing field and causing equalizing a total equalization of all hierarchies, and really amazing points. So because our consciousness have entered largely into matter, it's looking not so positive, the direction that it's going. All right, Abai or Karuna, you got some thoughts on this question?
I do, but I want to hear from Abai first.
Hari Vilaspu's points were so clearly articulated and thoughtful. I'll just follow up briefly with a couple of things. I think that there's maybe some distinctions to draw. Is technology is basically, like Hari Vilaspu was mentioning, it's like a human-driven design thinking approach to modifying the environment in some way, or to creating new capabilities that now become available to the self and to the society at large. And that itself as a practice may be faulty in some ways, as Hari Vilas was just mentioning, is that the more sattvic approach is not to use the intelligence in an attempt to modify the environment that much. Of course, there are exceptions to that. There may be cases in which it is prudent to modify the environment slightly, whether that's for, creating some kind of village and, the modifying the environment and the land, et cetera, to be able to support that village. That is not necessarily being discouraged, but primarily the utilization of conscious energy on the part of the individual and on the part of the society was not primarily used for modifying the environment. And that is based upon I think, deeper level of insight, which is what is the fundamental purpose of existence? And I think it gets down to this, where the fundamental purpose of existence in a Vedic society or in a godly society is self-realization or God realization. And therefore, the orientation of society and the orientation of the individual is how to best enable the attainment of that goal. And therefore, the modification of the environment through technology is not that important in order to attain that goal. It is somewhat important, but the primary utilization of intelligence should be for introspection, should be for the application of the principles of bhakti and for the understanding of the philosophy of bhakti that enables one to wholeheartedly invest themselves in that process. And naturally, by being absorbed in godly topics or godly behavior, the intelligence is satisfied. I think we've all had this experience that not only the intelligence, but the senses, the mind, the intelligence, the self is satisfied by engaging in spiritual activities and by becoming connected to God. And so therefore, the kind of underlying drive to use the intelligence in some way that is creating some change in the environment is not so much present, because one is satisfied internally by their absorption in Krishna. And all of their faculties are satisfied, not just at the soul level, but from the soul, then all of the, you could say, higher levels of existence into ego, intelligence, mind, senses, etc., are all satisfied by that absorption. And so when the fundamental purpose of existence is changed from self-realization or God realization to basically hedonism, then naturally, then how the intelligence is applied is in pursuit of hedonistic pleasure, which naturally leads to all the different, the emergence of all of the kinds of technologies that we've seen emerge over the last, several hundred or thousand years, and that we've seen emerge over the last 50 years. They are all essentially focused on furthering hedonistic pleasure for the self and for society. And again, that is not necessarily a categorical statement. There may be some exceptions to that, but on the whole, that is kind of the underlying intention. And therefore, the consideration of whether a technology is successful and is worth rolling out and dispersing to society is basically, does it improve sense enjoyment, or subtle enjoyment in one, physical, gross or subtle enjoyment in one way or another. And that is basically the binary criteria for whether the technology should be introduced or should be pursued at the front end. Which is a very myopic way as a society to think about and evaluate what changes should be made and what technology should be developed and implemented. If that is kind of the primary method of evaluating making change to society through technology or through other processes, is whether it enables sense enjoyment, gross or subtle sense enjoyment, then you end up with all kinds of unintended side effects in terms of harms that are created in other domains. Because and we know this not only philosophically but practically speaking, just pursuing sense enjoyment is basically a guaranteed path of misery. And we all experience this. Even non-spiritual people experience this. That just pursuing hedonic pleasure, sense enjoyment, is basically a path to like meaninglessness, depression, and all other kinds of suffering. And so, if technology is designed primarily with that intention, then it's not surprising that there are all kinds of unintended side effects in terms of even conventional harm to society, in terms of mental health and stability and sense of purpose and drive and all of these kinds of vital forces.
Excellent. I just shared the quote in the private chat, Bhishma, if you want to like pull it up. But what I was hearing from you is basically the problem comes because of a lack of, let's say, deep examination of your metaphysics. That's kind of what I was hearing. Because especially if you don't think about it, the metaphysics of a conditioned soul is to go after hedonism. Whereas in the Vedic culture, it was after self-realization, and that's going to determine the direction of the intelligence. This is a quote from Thomas Merton, but it's Thomas Merton writing a, how you say, like a glorification of Bhaktivedanta Swami's Gita. And in the course of that, he's making this particular statement, which I really, really, really like. I just wanted to read it. He says here, the present translation and commentary is another manifestation of the permanent living importance of the Gita. Swami Bhaktivedanta brings to the West a solitary reminder that our highly activistic and one-sided culture is faced with a crisis that may end in self-destruction because it lacks the inner depth of an authentic metaphysical consciousness. Without such depth, our moral and political protestations are just so much verbiage. I kind of that's a really powerful statement, and I've always resonated with a lot. But I was hearing that a lot from you because We haven't really examined our metaphysics, like what is the purpose of life? And so default is hedonism, basically, and that's going to inform that sort of destructive Viking intelligence towards the environment, which obviously leads to self-destruction and other problems. Am I catching that okay? I'm just giving a reflection. Noise. Y'all are some smart people. I'm telling you. This is
Yeah,
like,
I was just about to say, Juggernaut, you know, I think we should maybe reconsider inviting such like absurdly brilliant guests onto our show so that there's actually something left for us to say, instead of just like sitting here with like the crickets in the background.
Well, I just asked a question, so it's all right. I'm safe.
No. On the contrary, you know, we deliberate on these topics and we bring these great souls forward so that everyone can have the advantage of hearing their thoughts. So I just feel grateful to even just be here, and hear from these great souls also as a participant. Now I just have two like very brief points, and what I was going to say was already actually elucidated in different like way more profound wording than I could have possibly done it. But there's two, or let me first say this. The Google definition of artificial is something which is made or produced by human beings rather than occurring naturally, especially as a copy of something natural. Now, I think that the conception, or like the idea of artificiality is something really like central to this entire debacle, because what we see is, for instance, with the food that we eat, the more processed, the more man-made, the more processed, the worse it affects our health. And the closer to nature we stay, the more we eat whole foods and just kind of like, you know, have just a much more sort of a natural diet, the better we actually do. So, you know, like, I mean, Abai elucidated this completely in saying that, you know, if technology is utilized for hedonism, essentially it's a bane, and if it's utilized for self-realization, then it's a boon. But I still feel that there's something which has not quite been touched on, and that is, we have been, the biological organism of the human being has been created in a particular way, and we have a certain biological nature which is unchangeable, and which is fundamentally subject to either being healthy or being unhealthy. And there are certain things which are fundamentally good for us and bad for us. For instance, we know now very clearly that blue light, which emanates from electronic screens, is super bad for us, and it really disturbs our sleeping patterns, and that now all phones and computers come out with blue light filters standard, because that is something which is fundamentally not good for our health. Similarly, you know, the radioactive emanations out of 5G Wi-Fi towers, or you know, if you're sitting next to a modem all the time, you know, for hours and hours a day, that's certainly not going to affect your health very well. So now, you know, that kind of brings me to the point that we can use these devices for self-realization. Ultimately, that's what we're doing right now, right? But still, like, me looking at this screen, being fixed on these flashes of light and these artificial colors, is on a fundamental level biologically not that good for me, you know. So it's kind of like, I guess it kind of then just comes to where each of us is willing to draw the line personally. How far are you willing to go with it? You know, when Elon Musk's brain chip comes out, are you going to be part of the camp? Because that's going to be polarizing as hell. Are you going to be part of the camp that's going to be like, yay, smartness overload? Or are you going to be like, nah, you know, I want to grow stuff? in a field and be with my people in the village and like sing songs around the campfire. You know, what camp are you gonna choose? So it really comes down to this personal choice. And then, you know, Harry Vilas also very clearly made the point that this is inevitable. You know, society is meant to develop in this way. Humanity is meant to develop in this way, because just like the biological organism has been created with a certain, you know, unchangeable endowment and a certain biological nature, which is affected in certain ways that we can't change. So in the same way, we've also been created with intelligence and the ability to innovate. And so ultimately, everything that is being created right now technologically is inevitable. So then you can make the argument that perhaps it is actually natural, because we have the ability to bring it into being. So therefore, you know, perhaps it is natural and we just kind of have to roll with it. And then my sort of just like a final thing that I just want to bring out is that technology, because now, you know, our entire existence is, we are in these various cushioned cages for mind and soul.
Cushioned cages.
And
yes.
And it's just kind of like, you know, it just is what it is. Like, we are, if you're born in the world of today, you are, unless you're in just like a very unfortunate, impoverished condition, let's say you're born into the first world, you're going to be pretty comfortable. You're going to have all of your basic needs taken care of, like it's all going to be there. And then beyond basic needs, just the opportunities for indulgence that technology provides, it's just so easy, you know. It's just so easy. And so that kind of brings us to this point where comfort, excessive comfort, is not good for us. One of my favorite quotes is Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Srila Prabhupada's guru, who said that comfort is violence to the soul. You know, the more comfortable we are, the more comfortable the body is, the less impetus there is for self-realization. And so therefore we have to voluntarily accept austerity and minimize this like inescapable enveloping softness, you know, that is just like overwhelming us from all directions. Because also the other thing is that the more comfortable we are, the less likely we are to voluntarily take responsibility. I mean, if you were a hunter-gatherer 10,000 years ago, like, there's no choice, man. Like, you got to survive. Right now, like, I've never, not once in my life, had to worry about where my next meal is going to come from. Not once.
Yet.
Not yet.
Yes, well, you know, and here I am, like a little gremlin, basically, you know, a little comfort gremlin that is like taking a hella long time to grow up, you know, because I don't have to, you know, I don't have to. I got all the cushiness, you know. It's really nice. What's the impetus?
I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm just I think we're in sync right now, because that was the exact next question I had about the relationship between comfort and the demoralization of potential, which technology appears to be facilitating, and specifically how that plays out with men. I just want to reflect back some important points that I thought I just heard from you. Just basically looking at the word artificial, you Googled it. It's basically mimicking something that's real. And so it's kind of like one step removed from reality. And then as technology continues to advance itself and its ability to mimic reality, it becomes further removed from reality. And since it's inevitable, because it's coming from human intelligence, bringing forth these things and so on, at a certain point, one has to, the real question is, where do you want to draw the line in terms of your engagement with that which is slightly removed or profoundly removed from reality? And that's kind of the question that we definitely want to explore in this particular podcast. Like, it's artificial, it's removed. How much am I going to engage with that? I have to draw a line. And right now, as children of the millennial age, we don't seem particularly good at that. We don't know, because we're the first kind of generation really dealing with this profound bombardment of technology in the way that it's manifest now. So I wanted to get into this. Now, I was watching a couple of videos and reading some articles about the impact of technology specifically on man. And generally, there seems to be a consensus. I would have to do a lot more research to say that confidently, but there seems to be a general consensus that technology has kind of helped the upward mobility and social expansion of women, but it's had the exact opposite effect for men, where they're actually doing a lot worse because of it. Apparently so, at least. Taking that for granted, and again, that point is itself a sensitive point that would really have to be fleshed out, and you would probably need various expert footnotes and all that to really make that point. But just taking this, and this is more of a subjective question. We are the children, we are the, what did you call, comfort gremlins. We are the generation of comfort gremlins with our cushion cages. And the scripture, at least, especially the Bhagavad Purana, has a very strong message about the relationship between comfort and the destruction of potential. And I was, the verse, I have several verses in my head, but one verse that comes to mind, you know it well, Queen Kunti, she's praying that may the calamities come again and again. Bhavato darshanam yastat apunar bhava darshanam, because I can remember you, and in remembering you, I don't longer have to see birth and death. So a question comes, well, if calamity isn't a problem for you, what is a problem? Hypothetical question, and then answer is given in the next verse. With the expansion of wealth, beauty, knowledge, and aristocracy or position comes the expansion of pride. And Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti, one of the pre-modern commentators on this verse, gives one sentence where he basically says, Kunti is saying that comfort is actually the real danger in this world, where you feel kind of like, yeah, you know, I have this shelter, I'm good. So my question is about that, the relationship between comfort and a demoralization of potential, or sort of the innervation of potential. And I'm asking this kind of from I'm asking for your insight, but I'm also asking from a subjective experience to whatever degree. I'll give an example of subjective experience. When I was in high school, before there were smartphones, I had one of those like Nokia phones, all right? And I could remember literally 50 to 100 numbers off the top of my head, like quite easily. It wasn't very difficult. And come today, I can only remember my number. And even when it comes to like trying to memorize a number, it's like super duper hard. Now, this is just a very simple example of a personal impact of that I feel that I'm experiencing because of more of engagement with technology. So that's just an example. Insights, comfort as destroying our potential to show up not only as man, but just as human beings, and maybe a subjective experience of such. Do you agree with that? Do you not agree with that? Insights on that? That's the question.
Bro, basically, my entire existence is like the embodiment of potential being destroyed by comfort. I am the epitomized, personified form of that. Okay.
That's like that awkward laugh, like, should we really be laughing at this or not?
Tragic comedy.
No. It's just kind of like you have to experience a certain like extreme aspect, or like you have to experience one side of the spectrum of duality in order to be able to really understand what it is and to transcend it, and then ultimately to overcome. So I do think that even though it is very like suffocating, at the same time it can also be, because disillusionment is inevitable, and therefore it can also actually be a very powerful launch pad. So I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm just saying, it's just like everything that you're saying, it just makes so much sense, because that's my entire life right now, it
Well,
feels.
one thing is this illusion is not inevitable, so you have to be careful.
Yeah, fair enough. But you know, like provided that one is a sufficiently sincere and like discerning person, which I hope I am, then you know, you should be okay. I really hope so.
Well, actually, the system, if we see the mechanism that is built into the world, is that all opulences are as a result of piety, and they give you facilities, but then if you misuse those facilities, they are taken away. That's what will happen, is that your comfort and your opportunities will be removed from you if you don't use them properly. So that's, in general, a good kind of motivation to keep you, pull your socks up. But the one thing to also just understand, is an interesting point as you were speaking, about this distinction between artificial and natural. In one sense, also a fake distinction, because what is it? What is natural? What is artificial? I mean, ultimately, everything that exists in this world is natural. Show me something that's not natural. It's like, you know, it's a Whole Foods. It's a Whole Foods brand. You know, means that organic, whatever. You know, this is words we flip around. The thing to understand is that the highest form of technology is biological life, and all other forms of technology is actually just attempts to get closer to that. If you think about the human body, it's like the human body is the ultimate machine. There's nothing that can compete with it. And all other forms of technology, in one sense, is just somehow trying to replicate that, get as close to that as possible. Self-generating, regenerating. You know, the human eye, that's all the sensory capabilities. It's like the ultimate machine. If you could buy a body, imagine if you could sell someone a new body. You can. What kind of price tag would you put on that thing? Like, it's, people will pay billions. People will pay all that they have for a new body. If they could just transfer to a younger body, like Elon Musk, if at the end of his life, if you tell him, okay, here it is, we take all your money and you just get a normal human body. There's 7 billion of them on the planet, but you understand the value. So the highest form of technology, because we understand it was ultimately created. So similarly, this whole world is, in one sense, again, like, it's a created reality. But the purpose, so the distinction between the natural reality and the artificial human created reality, which is the reality that we have created for ourselves, is that, as Abai was saying, that the purpose of it is different. So the natural reality, as it is created for the sake of experience, coupled with purification. So therefore, for example, if you think about how everything in this world works, there's inherent difficulty built into the system, and that has a purpose. It's meant to protect you. It's meant to purify. It's meant to also give you some impetus in order to progress. You know, pain ultimately has a purifying effect. If you see about, for example, learning skills in the natural world, it takes time. So you have to learn patience, all these other kinds of things. Whereas think about the human reality, what's so comfortable about video games and whatever is that, in one sense, you sidestep a lot of these things. You know, you sidestep sleeping, eating, pain, because what's fascinating about the human virtual reality is that ultimately the world we are creating for ourselves virtually is just composed of 2 sensory experiences. There's only sight and sound to a certain extent. I mean, obviously now they're going to expanding into more sensory experiences, but so it's just like it's a dulled down version of reality. And the only reason why we find it more interesting is because it more directly, one sense, it accommodates more of our selfish desire. It looks like a reality that gives you more scope, because you can create your own little avatar or whatever it is. But the other reality is that, to understand that you're already living in a reality. You're already playing a game, and the game is way more intense. It's called real life. And there's the experience is way more intense. The stakes are way more higher, because you know you can die, and you can't reload. And by playing this game, if you actually understand that there's a purpose to the whole thing, and you're supposed to and then you understand the purpose is to elevate your consciousness, you know, purify your mind, embrace the duties that are given to you. Like, that's the understanding. So we just basically, because we're opting out, we're opting out from real life and opting for a dulled down, lesser version, but it's easier. And the better alternative is to just try to do the real thing, to work with the real system. And you see, it's so ironic, you know, we neglect playing computer games or virtual relationships, for example. It's all dialed down. It's all like, if you have a relationship via text, what is that? It's like, you just experience a little sliver of that other person just through text. What a waste of time, to text someone, like, in person. Now, obviously, technology is upping. Where for now we can have video chat, so that's amazing. Like, technology started with a lesser. You can have a little experience of a person, but now it's slowly coming to the point where we can have a near normal conversation, by virtue of video technology. But still, it's not as real. It will never be as satisfying as the actual 3D reality experience, as far as I can understand. Maybe at a certain point, but I mean, we have to also understand that there are limits to how far technology will go. People will tell you there's unlimited scope for development. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not sure if one will actually really be able to parallel actual 3D reality, because think about it, 3D reality was created by Lord Brahma. Versus, I'm saying, like, he's way more powerful than an Intel or Google engineer. It's like, there is just a difference of intelligence in terms of how it's structured out.
Nice.
Yeah.
Abai, I have something on that, but Abai.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts bumping around in my mind. One is, the thing that keeps coming back to me is like the fundamental orientation of the self is the key thing here, because even we are now, just thinking about us four and the people listening, we are greeted, and everyone is, but just thinking about us, with the opportunity to engage with kind of base reality, as Harivilas is describing, which is life itself, organic life itself. Even that is not purely organic in the sense that just living in the world outside of screens, outside of digital technology, you could call it, outside of digital media, is still, you're living in a realm of technology in a lot of ways. So technology is ever present. So that has to be acknowledged. We're greeted with that opportunity, as well as the opportunity to live in kind of a virtualized experience. And so if one's fundamental motivation is what you would call either dharmic, or at the first level, or transcendent at the second level, dharmic meaning kind of the conventional development of the self in the realm of material activity, but still oriented towards the realization of one's potential and most kind of complete contribution to themselves and to their family and to society in a holistic sense. If one is aligned in that direction, then one will feel more motivated towards engaging with life itself and the challenges and opportunities that are present there, in order to pursue that goal of manifesting one's kind of dharmic potential, and ideally then beyond their transcendent potential, their spiritual potential. But if one is simply oriented towards providing themselves with as much mental and sensual stimulation and pleasure as possible, then they will be much more inclined towards technology and towards not only engaging with technology as it exists today, but following the path of technology as it develops, because technology is inherently designed, at least much of technology is inherently designed just to better and better stimulate the mind and senses. And so if that is the fundamental motivation, then we will naturally be drawn in that way. And if the fundamental motivation is for, again, dharmic realization, self-realization, then we will naturally navigate life in such a way that we find the things that are favorable for that, which are more base reality experiences. And I think that's the thing that keeps coming back to me. That being said, speaking practically, it's not a binary situation. I find myself with a combination of motivations for my existence. Some of them are more noble, dharmic, transcendent, spiritual, as much as I can possibly kind of conceptualize. And some are for sense gratification or mental, intellectual stimulation in the material realm, in the material sphere. And so I find myself, honestly, battling between the two, and therefore battling with more engaging with my life as it is present before me, understanding it as arranged by God, by Krishna, for being suitable for developing my material and spiritual potential, and therefore attending to it with my full attention, my full intelligence, and my full kind of emotional capacity such that I can attend to this situation that Krishna has arranged for me that's appropriate for me to develop. When I'm seeing my life in that way, then I'm putting my phone down to go and attend to my children to try to nourish them materially and spiritually. When I'm more in the consciousness of just stimulate my mind, stimulate my intelligence, stimulate my senses, then the intention, this is much more of the option that I go to, because, and I think this is an important point that you're kind of hinting to, Jagannath, this thing, where's, get it in phone, in frame, this is a portal to all variety of sensual and mental and emotional stimulation at your fingertips. And that is a wonderful thing if you are sensually oriented and if you are hedonistically oriented as an individual or as society. And that is a really scary thing if you have some other competing values, right? Because like Hari Vilas was saying, not only organically, just in, again, base reality, is the fulfillment of natural desires often behind many layers of endeavor and of self-sacrifice and of discipline and of taking on responsibility. But society, Vedic society specifically, is set up in such a way to augment that, to enhance that, right? Simply the idea, for example, of sex within marriage, and even within marriage having some other regulations around sexual intercourse. That is, in a sense, at least to look at it in one way, that is intentionally set up so that the person who is desiring sex, which is everyone, right? That
all the way up to Lord Brahma, according to third canto. Everyone.
Right. But that in order to obtain that, if society is set up in such a way and the values are correctly oriented, that they will engage in so many things that will benefit themselves and benefit society at large, and benefit their partner and their future family, etc. By becoming qualified, ideally going to Gurukul and learning all of the necessary arts and being under the tutelage of a guru, then being properly matched with somebody who has a similar psychophysical nature that's compatible with them, taking on the responsibility of their well-being and protection for their entire life without any exception, etc., etc., etc. These are all heavy burdens that develop oneself in such a way that they are able to more straightforwardly and successfully pursue, again, their material and their spiritual well-being, but also that so that the society that they exist within gets the benefit of that person developing in that way. And now there is no need for any of that to get to the end goals of all of the varieties of sensual and mental and emotional stimulation that we organically desire and need. They're all available here. And so what is the impetus for somebody to go through hardship to get what might be a 2x version of that sensual stimulation? If you can get it in real life, I can get a 1x version. Yeah, it's a little bit of a discount, but there's no cost. There's no cost. I don't have to spend any time or inflict any austerity or discipline upon myself to get to that. And so that's going to win almost every time. And I think that's what we're seeing happening. And so speaking to the kind of demoralization of men or of people based upon access to technology, I think when you think about it from the perspective of digital technology, and then on top of digital technology, digital media, which I think is an important distinction to draw, that is especially pernicious when you think about there's technology as like manipulating the environment for some kind of end goal, may or may not be harmful or helpful depending on what the orientation and the intention is. And there's digital technology. And then on top of digital technology, there's digital media. And I think digital media specifically has this individual and social effect.
What's the difference between digital technology and digital media?
So like digital technology is something like a computer, right? So like I'm on a computer right now. I use this for work, making spreadsheets or whatever. That is not necessarily kind of corrupting my being, right? There is some effect to now work being done on a computer instead of within the context of a village or outside, dealing with nature, etc. That aside, I'm engaging with digital technology for work every day. And that is, I would say, significantly less kind of acutely corrupting to my being than
Mm.
watching Netflix or watching YouTube, which is in the category of digital media. And then, of course, there's worse versions of digital media as well.
Wow. Yes. Okay, I want to pick up on something here. This is getting into the sort of title for this particular podcast. But basically, just coming back to something Harvey last said, you know, with reality, there's this sort of built-in mechanism of effort and struggle and hardship and austerity necessary for achieving goals. It's kind of just built into the reality, whether you're pious or impious. And technology allows you to circumvent that issue, even if it is downgraded, as you said, it's a 1x version instead of a 2x version. It allows you to sidestep that. And the reason it's particularly appealing is because it more easily accommodates for our selfish desires. Harvey Vilas brought this particular thing up, which I thought was a really fantastic way of articulating it. And coming to something you said, Abhay, there's this struggle inside of values, especially if you're a more gentlemanly person, spiritual person, sadhaka, yogi. There's this inner tension of competing values. On the one hand, sometimes I'm really intent upon transcendence. Some days, especially since lockdown's been here, you know, a lot of leaning toward more selfish desires, a kind of sort of self-absorption. I'm suffering, I'm unhappy, I'm alone. And so that which can facilitate that selfish desire becomes all the more appealing. So it seems to me, not only in the world in general, but in our own spiritual communities, our devotional communities, which is probably a reflection of the microcosm, that we're having a hard time getting enough W's on the side of our highest values, whether they're dharmic or transcendent. And at least I can speak personally, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this also. But I guess with the expansion of technology and with the environment becoming, at least appearing to become more aggressive, more like imposing, you know, lockdowns and can't move anywhere. And then the desire for selfish engagement has become more. Desire for sensual engagement is becoming more. And so I find myself retreating into isolation more and more and more. Of course, with my bae, what would I do without you? I find myself retreating more into isolation. Now, whether it's in mostly digital media specifically, whether it's, you know, Instagram or Facebook arguments, which is all the fun. I don't know if you saw my little post yesterday. It's so much fun. Or it's pornography, or it's video games. And you can be like living in the house with people, but you're completely alienated from them. So I find that I guess my question is, how are we supposed to successfully navigate this tension, specifically as people who have higher purposes, higher values in God? How are we supposed to navigate this increasing evolution of technology in such a way that we don't lose that in the cesspool of our selfish desires manifested externally as engagement with all this terrible, you know, this technology? Because it doesn't seem to me that, it seems to me that we could use some insight on how to do that. Now, obviously, as children of the technological age, we're probably not going to have the best insight because we're still at the present moment, at least many of us are kind of victims of that. But having reflected on our victimhood to some degree, how would you suggest we navigate this and I don't know, get a couple more W's for the side of our highest values, lest we suffer just increasing alienation?
Well, I think that firstly, human culture develops to help humanity, in one sense, deal in the best way with its environment. You know, so what's happening now is that we should also now develop a culture surrounding technology. Like, say, for example, there's something like alcohol. Like, you know, like many families, you know, especially in the West, we've had alcohol for a long time, you know. Like my ancestors, they've been dealing with alcohol for many, many generations. And there's certain rules that they've learned, like, okay, you can't drink in the morning. That's like culturally not appropriate. If you're going to start drinking a beer at 11 o'clock, people are going to be like, oh, that's not good, because it's a cultural wisdom that's there, that's sort of built up, dealing with something very dangerous, but there's a culture that regulates it. And therefore, you have millions of people that are recreational drinkers and they're not destroyed, even though it's something very dangerous. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying that you can see
Right.
culture is to regulate things. So now the problem is that we just we don't have any culture to regulate this thing, and that's what's obviously the only way to get away from it is impossible. I mean, you can try your best for a little bit, but it's not really. You can run, but you can't hide. Because even just to make money, who doesn't have to sit in front of a computer to work? Because that's the reality now. It's like a work that you're not sitting in front of a computer is just not going to pay anything. So the point is you can't run away from, but therefore a culture, to regulate it by culture, to understand. There's certain things, like for me, for example, what I do is that I used to, I mean, now it's really difficult since being in New York, but at least I had certain caps to my day, like I had a 9 o'clock flight mode and a 9 a.m. I put it on again. So at least I go I sleep, I have an hour at least before bed. I only put my phone on after breakfast. Like that's a form of culture. By culture, you start to regulate it, which is the actual Vedic principle, is that you regulate whatever it is there, it has to be regulated. So that's one form of regulation. And naturally, the highest form of regulation, as I was saying, that there's a functional use of technology that protects you. It's not the same. It doesn't degrade the consciousness. It's still bad for your eyes and it's still bad for your back. And that's still there to sit in front of a computer. But your consciousness is not degraded because there's a functional purpose behind what you're doing. You're doing it. You're doing your work. You protect it, the consciousness, because you're not doing it for gratification. So therefore also we have to, I think, flesh it out. Like if we are going to spend a lot of time on the internet or on the technological world, then you have to spiritualize that world by taking up spiritual responsibility within that field. That's the only way, because then you will use it, but you will be protected. You will be protected because your consciousness is that you're not doing this for your own pleasure. You're doing this for a greater cause. Like, and you see so many people, they need God. There's so much, everything is happening on the whole devotional world is also happening on the digital platform. So you have to do some service on that world. If you're going to live in that world, then you have to include this functional service engagement, and that will actually protect you from it. That really protects one from these things. Like there's this nice essay by Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Maharaj, and he was saying how the Vaishnava mentality is that one takes an offensive stance. Like instead of just defending yourself, like sitting it back and trying to create a little bubble that will protect you from material influence, you have to go out and you have to engage with it with a spiritual purpose. And that's and means that then you push back this influence, even though you're on that platform itself. And that is actually Krishna consciousness. Krishna consciousness is that the service mentality, the mentality of service, is the thing that will protect you from the corrupting influence, and that counts also on the technological realm. And one has to make that apart. And then you just have to again accept that responsibility. Like for me, it's taken me a few years to accept that I cannot run away from this thing. I cannot run away from Instagram or whatever. So this year I capitulated and I made my first Instagram post. And that's because I realized this is the only way I'm going to be able to save myself is if I actively put something positive on the medium, and then at least somehow one is protected from just becoming a consumer. But in general, one other thing I have to say is that you were making the point that people are getting isolated, and in the actual fact, people are not at all isolated. People are just isolated maybe from real world, but very few people are now able to actually be alone. Because whenever they're so-called alone, so generally, like being alone, we see even Krishna gives it as one of the principles of yoga, to be in a solitary place, ekaki yata chittatma. So there's something with solitude that allows you to get a distance from the world and allows you to process whatever you have experienced. Like when you're alone, everyone needs solitude, real solitude, where it's just you and your internal world, and you're thinking and reflecting, and it allows you to fall. Just like if you eat, at a certain point, you have to stop eating. You have to stop eating, and you just have to sit to digest. You have to do nothing. So similarly, I think that's one of the biggest things that people have to start implementing into their life is real periods of genuine isolation, where you really just where you really put your phone down and you really just are alone. because that's what making people so mad, is because they never have a break. My God, your brain is never given any kind of break, because our recreational experience is now also on the internet, and it is a false recreation, because if you look at even Bhagavad Gita 6 chapter explain how the yogi is balanced in work, in eating, sleeping, work, and recreation. So recreation is a pivotal part of culture. Viharas, yeah. So vihara means you do something that recreates you, that regenerates you. And I promise you, there's not a single form of positive recreation on the technological medium, because the medium in itself is stimulating. The medium itself is based on stimulating something within your consciousness. It plugs. So even if you look at freaking a video of the waves, if you go on YouTube, pictures of the sea, it's not stimulating. It feels sort of stimulating, but a part of your basic biological being is not stimulated, because you're still glued to some screen and you're still looking at light. So there's a form of recreation. We have to. I think that's the most important part of the. At least for the spiritualists, do your work with technology as much as you can. It's not a problem, but find your recreation somewhere else. Find your recreation in the natural world. Like find some recreational pursuits that allow you to plug out, because there you will really be able to recreate, relax, have your mind not be constantly filtering information, and so this is the only way out. And this all relates to the initial point that I made. It's about creating a new culture. So as we, and in one sense, for many of us, teaching that culture to your children, like your children have the opportunity now to get raised with certain parameters in place. You teach them from a young age, listen, this is how you use a cell phone, and then they create these new samskaras. They know you don't use a cell phone after night, you don't use your cell phone before breakfast. It just becomes ingrained into them, just like so many other things have been ingrained into them, and it's a form of social capital that we can then give to the next civilization. Just like we've learned how to deal with sex, smoking, drugs, so many impressions that we have gotten from our parents, and it has been very valuable. And now we took the first hit, because we were just thrown into this thing without any kind of preparation. Our parents didn't know how to use this stuff. But now slowly we will have to create some kind of culture that allows us to deal with it in a more responsible way, until it all collapses and we can go back to a more natural way.
Just I wanted to share this. I often share this quote. This is from Blaise Pascal. All man's miseries derive from not being able to sit in a quiet room alone.
Without a phone.
Yeah, without a phone.
Important.
Right, important add-on. I guess what I mean by alienation, also just to expand that just quickly, is that technology creates a sort of artificial connectedness, while was also simultaneously making us more and more alienated from one another, and even from our own selves. Because as you engage in a virtual world, you're not dealing with your real life, and ultimately the impetus to engage in a virtual world is because your real life has got some pain, some aspect of it that you want to not have to deal with. It's kind of connected to the desire for transcending the self that you don't like, and technology really facilitates that. And in that sense, it makes us more and more alienated from each other, from our own lives, and just kind of a step further from God. Because you're so engaged in a fake world, that the real world, even beyond the biological world that is Prakriti, is reality, the beautiful Krishna and this divine transcendent world, but you're too sucked into this world and alienated from all of that because of it. So that's kind of the sense. It's very interesting, because on the one hand, you become solitude so you can become more connected. And the reverse is happening in the modern world, where you're apparently more connected through technology and you become more alienated. It's like a very, what's the verse? Yanisha Sarabhutanam. What is night for common man is time of awakening for the self-control. And the time of awakening for the self-control is night for the introspective sage. So it's kind of interesting how this dichotomy comes up. By solitude, you can become more connected, and by too much engagement with technology, you become more alienated. And I guess that was the sense I meant by alienation there.
Yeah, you can definitely see it in living in a temple or in a spiritual community. Yeah, it's a fact, because now it's like people don't form relationships anymore in the temple environment, because everybody's on their phone. They have their social life on their phone. Who has time to do the people in the body? Like,
right.
time for that stuff, you know, sit with them and take breakfast. My God, what a slap, you know. You just go eat. So it's fundamentally also altered communal spiritual experience. Even I don't know if I've ever been to a rainbow festival.
Of course, I've been to several.
So then I remember I went to a rainbow in Poland, and one guy was telling me, yeah, the rainbow, it's ruined because people bring their phones. You know, in the past, everybody went there. You were forced to be present with the people that were there at that place. You were forced to participate because there was nothing else to do. You know, but now, for example, why would you even go to a Bhagavatam class? God, there's so many Bhagavatam classes, so many way better Bhagavatam classes I can watch on my phone. You know, why would I go sit here and listen to? You know, I can listen to the best people in the world. I mean, even though I don't, but so we see that there's a certain sense of presence that is ruined. So people are not actually present. But what is interesting is, if you think about it karmically, the people that you are with, these are the people that Krishna has said. This is the people that fate has allotted to you. This is the people. These are the people that will purify you. That's traditional way of seeing it, is that whoever is with me, these are the people that are now sent by God, for better or worse. These are the people that will purify me. These are the people that will give me shelter. And if I invest in creating a relationship with whoever is present in my specific environment, as if they are sent by God, then that relationships have depth. But now it's very difficult to have that consciousness. It's because, you know, and even what's interesting is that if you would, how much easier it is to have digital relationships with people, because you never conflict. You know, because the moment that it's awkward, you're just like, okay, I have to go poop, you know. so it's you can see how, again, it's this thing of alienation and excess comfort, and people are not confronted. It's very difficult confronted with uncomfortable realities or with growing experiences in a technologically modeled world, because the whole principle of technology is to customize your experience according to your personal preference. Yeah? And that is just not what the world is actually about. You know, the world as God created it is not really. That's not what it's meant for.
Abai.
Yeah.
Karuna, you got anything on this?
I just have one quick insert to make here. Firstly, I just want to acknowledge the comments of some wonderful listeners. Mara Lee Mrigakshi said, we have free will to use or abuse God's energy, but are not free from the resultant reactions. So and that's the hectic thing, is that we just, you know, most of the time it's instant gratification, but delayed delayed consequence. Destruction. And then David Madhava says, for the most part, tech hasn't changed who we are, only magnified it and shown the sorry condition of our actual hopes and dreams in the meantime.
Thank you, David Madhava. I feel very inspired by that.
Yeah, that's heavy. That's heavy, but it has to be said. I have an answer to this that I can summarize in one sentence, and that is to intentionally, actually forcefully, willfully cultivate loving relationships in real life, so that we will be naturally inspired to make sacrifices. I honestly think that's the only solution. For myself, at least, that's how I see it. And whether those loving relationships come in the form of a family, which is the most natural framework for it, or, you know, in a brotherhood of co-monks, or, you know, temple residents, or whatever it may be. But those real life loving relationships are the only things, because that's the thing, you know, in love, we are capable of making infinite sacrifices and shoving aside our selfishness. And I honestly just don't see any other way personally that I'm going to be able to do it, you know. And you know, I'm sure Abai is the only one amongst us who's already married, and I'm sure that this is something that he experiences on a day-to-day basis, because you put yourself in that situation, you are a family man with many children and a wife that I'm sure that you love very much. And therefore, there is just no choice but to put aside your selfishness. So the willful acceptance of that and the cultivation of those loving relationships of the essence.
Beautiful comment. So we got from Harvey Last, we need a culture. And as a first generation dealing with this, we have to kind of develop that so we can hand it on to the next generation. They can do a little bit better than us with it. And the intentional, willful cultivation of loving relationships from Karuna Avatar, they give the motivation to make the necessary sacrifice to put aside selfishness and enter into reality. Very brilliant comment. Well, boy.
I would just, can I bold, underline, and italicize everything?
That's what I usually do.
That's what I feel like doing at the moment. I would say just the beautiful synthesis of those 2 points of the fundamental protecting element that we can actually pursue outside of isolation or a complete removal of ourself from these potentially harmful, stimulations externally in the form of tech and digital media, is to cultivate is to cultivate devotionalism as our kind of primary framework for life and our primary method of interacting with the environment. I think in that, if that is cultivated, then our use of technology will be proper, our engagement with the world will be proper, because we should acknowledge here, removing technology doesn't remove the problem of unsuccessful or unfulfilling or destructive behavior and a destructive society and destructive existence. Technology may have amplified or magnified that in some ways or accelerated that in some ways, but just getting rid of technology doesn't mean we're in some kind of blissful existence. After all, we are in the realm of death here. So, just removing technology doesn't remove the problem. It may remove some of the stimulations that make the problem more apparent or more magnified or amplified, as Dave Amato was saying in the comments. So therefore, the removal of technology or changing our relationship with technology specifically is not a comprehensive solution. The comprehensive solution is changing our underlying approach to life and the way in which we view ourselves and people in our life and the environment more broadly. Changing from an inclination and an approach of exploitation, which is how can I use the environment and all of its constituents to serve my short-term false ego-based needs, to a devotionalistic approach, which is how can I utilize the environment and all of its constituent components, including myself and all of the faculties that I possess, in the service of the complete whole, right? In the service of absolute reality, in the form of Krishna, in the form of God, in the form of his devotees, and in his parts and parcels, and in the form of my relationship with his Shakti, the material world. And so, as much as that is potentially a lofty goal, and certainly one that we're all pursuing over time, that is the fundamental solution. And I would also say that practically speaking, it is a very how do you say? It's not as unavailable as it may sound of changing our fundamental, approach to existence. If we accept our philosophy, we actually believe that is the natural orientation of the soul. Just like water in a river flows towards the ocean, or fire goes up towards the source, the sun. We believe that the soul is really inclined towards service, towards the absolute reality. And just for myself, giving some examples, I ask myself this question often. It's like, what is my approach? What am I thinking? Or how can I be of service in this situation? To myself, to my family, to my coworkers, to my friends, and all of the relationships. How can I be of service? And that question, really following that question, I think, for me at least, has led to better and better decisions around the use of technology specifically, but also just in life in general. And or is the action that I'm engaged in right now, is that of service and of benefit to myself and my family and my community and everybody that is in touch with me? That is a very helpful kind of question check that can, in real time, kind of change our behavior and our decisions.
Wow.
Wow. Them cherries.
I like to. Okay, so we're gonna finish up here. I guess if I had any, just based on what I'm hearing from you guys, I'm kind of understanding more and more that one of the fundamental human desires is the desire for self-transcendence. And what I mean by that is that basically everyone since the dawn of time, all humans have had an experience where there's something about their self as they view it that's dissatisfying, and that leads to the desire for wanting to leave that self behind, or you can call it a self-transcendence. I was reading this recently also, and there's like a positive self-transcendence and like a negative type. And then I think the negative types are more prominent, where you take shelter of drugs, because drugs gives you a sense of a greater self that's more interconnected, especially if you do like psychedelics. And so I never had the experience, but from what I've heard, there's this greater sense of like interconnected, a sort of union with a greater self beyond just the isolated self. Or debauchery is a really kind of type of self-transcendence, a negative type, where you kind of, there's union with another person, and at a certain point you can just forget about yourself. And I think technology is, as it's being, especially digital media, is facilitating this desire for self-transcendence, but it's kind of going in a negative way. There's something about myself that I don't like or I don't want to deal with, something about my life. And so I can just enter into this other world where I can make a better self for myself, whether it's my avatar or it's a video game character, or it's like a movie character or some sports athlete. I don't have to deal with myself. I can enjoy vicariously through another self. And so unless we discover a sort of, I don't know, what's the word, like a regenerated self, like at least for our devotional consciousness, unless we discover the ideal self, and ultimately the ideal self is a self that's created to the greater self that is God. And it's inherently self-satisfying and pleasing. Only by such positive self-transcendence can I really have a healthy orientation toward whatever I engage with in the world, which is what I'm hearing from Abai. So yeah, otherwise just a desire to escape I like to use this word, innervated self. Like the self, like I know the self that I am now is not always the most satisfying. Not always, most of the time. I wake up feeling existential dread. Like, why do I exist? And that happens to me when I take a nap. I don't know if you take a nap, you meant to do like 5 minutes, but you accidentally did like an hour and a half. And you like wake up and you're just like, why do I even exist? And there's something just like radically dissatisfying about the self that I am. And so then I want to take shelter of, digital media or whatever it is. So definitely at the heart, it's a discovery of a greater self that's more broad, that's more interconnected, with a greater reality. And I think the idea of the devotionalism, using your term, helps us to see that greater reality, like that interaction with that greater reality with the vision of devotion, can help us have a sense of self that's more inherently satisfying and can lead to a healthier engagement with, the world around us, including the technology in it. That's kind of what I'm getting from all you, with, combined with the culture and the loving relationships. I want to thank you. Have something on Current Avatar? Or you just
I just want to point out what Jiva is saying here.
Yeah,
and we don't want to open up a whole new can of worms, but it should be acknowledged. So he says, so I've made this argument before, and it's mainly based on my own experience. My brain's communication matrix and pleasure chemical cycles have been 100% merged with technology. To remove technology from my daily life is to throw me into an extremely uncomfortable condition where I actually experience physical symptoms of distress. even my so-called relaxing walks in the forest would be tainted with my chill out playlist on YouTube. So to go back to the good old days where more natural phenomena prevail seems to be impossible. This is my personal experience, but I believe it's relevant to society as a whole. Do you think otherwise?
No, it's like a, I guess I've not had this experience, but withdrawal from some drug or something. I have seen that with my mother. She was a heavy smoker from a young age. And I remember when she was trying to stop smoking when I was in high school, and she would go through these terrible withdrawals that I just really couldn't relate to because I'd never had the experience with smoking. But she would describe it something similar to what we hear from Jiva. So such is going
Jiva,
to
you
be the
may,
challenge.
yeah, you may have to like do some self-imposed cold turkey, just to kind of like show yourself that it is possible. The temporary, you know, because we cannot say, oh, it's inevitable, and so I have no other choice but to be enslaved, completely enslaved and subject to these conditionings. There has to be a certain acceptance of, like, I feel, personal responsibility and acknowledging that you are fundamentally aloof from it. It's just about what really motivates you on the deepest level and what you really want on the deepest level. And if you have relationships to sacrifice for, then that's all the impetus we require. That's what I feel.
You can read Pranahari has one comment similar.
Yeah, that's a really good
similar
one. And
yeah.
Rob, I just also want to say what Rob said, to change the inner dialogue from what's in it for me to how I can serve is to enter the domain of the soul. I really, really like that. Absolutely, that's what it comes down to. And Pranahari says, loving relationships as the main impetus for continuous selfless sacrifices is Bhakti philosophy in a nutshell, and how necessary it is to cultivate these amongst each other as preceding the awakening of the relationship with Krishna has yet to be discovered by many, I think, definitely for me. Yeah.
So I guess that's going to be the work of our generation. I feel like every generation has some important work, you can say, that kind of marks that generation out specifically. Like if you look at our movement, you know, the first generation of devotees, Hare Krishna devotees, their work is like very specific. And then from our generation, it's going to be another different specific sort of work. And this may be part of that work. At least I get a sense that this is going to be very much part of that work, if the next generation is going to do any better than we are. Thank y'all for coming on. This was a very wonderful conversation as usual. I'm always humbled before Harvey Vilas and Abhay Prabhu. I like to say also, Abhay is one of the only relationships that I developed on Instagram. So I do have a positive experience with technology. I was doing a 100-day challenge on Instagram 2 years ago. And Abhay kind of just reached out to me and said, you know, I really like what you do. Can we connect? And I was like, yeah, sure. And from the first day that we talked, like online, I became super attached to him. Like on the first day, just hearing how he thinks, and I just felt very similar. And then seeing him for the first time, I think was last year in November at the Holy Name Festival. And then I became more attached. So I do have positive experience of relationship building through technology. A couple others. Harvey last I met in person in Bhakti Center, and we became very close there. So, but generally, technology can be problematic if we don't discover the culture, the devotionalism, this positive self, the integrated or positive self. So thank y'all so much for coming on and continuing to this initiative. It's been very wonderful. A special thanks to Bhishma Dave helping in the background with the questions. He's in the blurbs. They're all coming from Bhishma. Special thanks to him. You can give us a follow on Satsang, SSAT, S.A.T Sangha on Instagram. And if you're interested in any of our men's sanghas, you can send a DM to that Instagram and we'll definitely respond. Just by this podcast that we're doing is having a lot of positive effect. I'm getting at least 3 or 4 letters every week from guys all over the world, asking entry into the group, sharing their personal stories. So this is very positive use of technology. Going back to, I think, Hari Velasquez, you were saying this, we have to address it by going on the offensive and using technology on the offensive. So this particular endeavor is showing some positive fruits. So special thanks there. Special thanks to Boudica for hosting us. And please give Boudica a follow on Facebook and Instagram. And maybe there's some other social media outlets, I'm not sure. And check out the many devotional creators putting out wonderful work there. Until our next episode next week, Hari Om Tat Sat. Thanks a lot. Hare Krishna, Hare Rama.